When I was a child, I thought my mother didn't like me very much. Not in a dramatic way. She never yelled, never insulted me. She just existed at a distance I couldn't cross. Other girls talked about their moms like best friends, sharing secrets in the kitchen, laughing over coffee. My mother moved quietly through rooms, cleaning counters that were already clean, folding laundry with sharp precision, speaking only when something needed to be said. In the mornings, she packed my lunch without notes.
No smiley faces.
Just a sandwich wrapped tight, an apple wiped clean, and a soft reminder to grab my jacket. When I came home with a bad grade, she didn't scold me. She said, "You'll do better next time," and went back to the stove. That hurt more than yelling would have. I wanted her reaction. I wanted proof she cared. As I grew older, I decided she was emotionally unavailable. That was the word I learned in college. It fit neatly. It made sense. When I moved out, we spoke once a week. Short calls, weather updates, safe topics. When she asked if I was eating well, I answered quickly, like it was an obligation, not concern. At 29, after a quiet breakup and a job that drained me more than I admitted, I came back to her house to clear the guest room. She had downsized. Said she didn't need much space anymore. The house felt smaller, but heavier, like it was holding its breath. While sorting through an old closet, I found a shoebox tucked behind winter coats that smelled like time. Inside were envelopes.
Dozens of them.
All addressed to me. My name written in my mother's careful handwriting. None had been opened. I sat on the floor, back against the closet wall, holding that box like it might disappear if I didn't. The envelopes were dated. Some from when I was 6. Some from high school. A few from my early 20s. My hands shook as I opened the first one. It wasn't long. Just a page. The paper thin, slightly yellowed. She wrote about watching me sleep after my first day of kindergarten. About standing in the doorway, afraid to wake me, afraid to forget the way my face looked when I was calm. She wrote that she didn't know how to say, "I love you" out loud without feeling like she might say it wrong. That her own mother never said it, and silence felt safer than mistakes. I opened another. This one from the year my father left. I remembered that year as cold dinners and empty chairs. In the letter, she apologized to me for not crying where I could see it. She said she cried in the shower so I wouldn't feel like the world was breaking. She said she thought strength meant quiet. Each letter revealed a version of her I had never met. A woman afraid of failing me. A woman who worked extra shifts and came home exhausted but stayed up to sew my Halloween costume by hand. A woman who believed love was shown by consistency, not words. I had spent years believing her distance was indifference. Sitting there, surrounded by the proof of her private tenderness, I realized something painful and humbling. She hadn't been cold. She had been careful. And I had mistaken her restraint for absence. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For the first time, I wondered how long she had been waiting for me to understand. That night, I didn't sleep. I lined the letters across the bed like a timeline of my life, moments I thought I understood now rewritten in her words. There was one from the year I slammed my bedroom door and told her I couldn't wait to leave. I remembered her face then, still controlled. In the letter, she wrote that she sat on the kitchen floor after I went to school, holding that door handle, wondering when I stopped needing her voice and started needing her silence. By morning, the house woke the way it always had.
Soft sounds.
Cabinets opening carefully. The coffee machine humming low. She didn't mention the box when I walked into the kitchen. She never did mention things unless they demanded attention. She poured coffee into my mug the way she always had, filled it just below the rim so it wouldn't spill when I walked. I watched her hands. Older now. Small scars I didn't remember. I wanted to say something big. Something that matched the weight of what I'd learned. Instead, I said, "I found some old things last night." She nodded, like she already knew which things. "I didn't know if I should give them to you," she said. "I thought maybe you'd find them when it mattered." That sentence sat between us. When it mattered. I realized how much of her love had been built around timing, around protecting me from what she carried. I asked why she never gave them to me before. She shrugged lightly. "You were busy growing up. I didn't want my feelings to get in your way." For the first time, I heard regret in her voice. Not loud, just honest. I reached across the table and rested my hand on hers. It felt unfamiliar. Necessary. She didn't pull away. Over the next few days, I stayed longer than planned. We moved through the house together, sorting, donating, throwing away things neither of us needed anymore. She told stories she'd never told before, about being a young mother with no roadmap, about choosing practicality over softness, because no one had taught her how to balance both. I started noticing the ways she loved that I'd ignored. How she always kept my favorite cereal, even after I moved out. How she cut articles out of newspapers and stacked them neatly, topics she thought might help me someday. How she checked the weather in my city every morning. One afternoon, while folding towels, I asked her why she never hugged me first. She paused, towel midair. "I was afraid you'd think I was asking for something," she said. "I wanted you to feel free." That answer stayed with me. All those years I thought freedom meant distance. Now I saw how love could look like restraint when someone is afraid of being a burden. On my last night, I packed the letters into my bag. She stood in the doorway, unsure if she should stop me. I told her I was taking them to read again, slower this time. She smiled, not wide, but real. At the door, I hugged her first. She hesitated, then held me like she had been waiting for permission her entire life. Driving away, I understood something that felt both heavy and peaceful. Love doesn't always sound like affection. Sometimes it sounds like quiet. Sometimes it waits patiently, hoping one day you'll learn how to listen. And finally, I had. Back in my apartment, the silence felt different. Not empty, just unfamiliar. I unpacked slowly, placing the letters in my bedside drawer instead of hiding them away. Every night before sleep, I read one. Not in order. I chose them by mood. Some nights I needed the younger version of her, unsure and hopeful. Other nights, I needed the tired woman who kept going anyway. I started noticing how her voice lived inside me, in the way I saved receipts, in how I double-checked locks, in how I stayed calm when things fell apart. I had always told myself I was independent because I raised myself. Now I saw the truth. I was steady because she had been. I called her more. Not the polite weekly calls, but short ones. To tell her I burned dinner. To ask how long eggs really last. Sometimes there was silence on the line, comfortable, unforced. Sometimes she told me small things. The neighbor's dog died. Her knees hurt in the cold. Once, she laughed at something I said, surprised by her own sound. I realized how much time we'd lost by being careful with each other. One evening, she asked if I remembered a blue sweater she used to wear when I was little. I didn't. She said she stopped wearing it because I once told her it was itchy when she hugged me. I felt something tighten in my chest. How many choices had she quietly made, never announcing the cost? That night, I wrote her a letter back, my handwriting uneven. I told her about the child I had been, how I mistook quiet for absence, how I was learning, slowly, to translate her language of love. I mailed it the next morning before I could overthink it. She called me 3 days later. Her voice sounded different, softer, but not fragile. "I got your letter," she said. Then she stopped. I waited. I could hear her breathing, steadying herself the way she always had. "I didn't know you noticed," she finally said. "I didn't," I answered. "Not then." We talked longer than usual, about things we'd avoided, about how love doesn't always meet us where we expect it, about how both of us thought we were protecting the other by staying quiet. There was grief in that realization, but also relief. A few weeks later, she visited me for the first time in years. We walked through my neighborhood. She asked questions, real ones, not the polite kind. I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, the same way she once watched me sleep. Before she left, she hugged me without hesitation. No waiting.
No permission.
After she drove away, I stood in my doorway for a long time. I understood something I wish I had learned sooner. Some people love deeply but quietly. They don't announce it. They leave traces. They trust time to do the explaining. I had spent years resenting a silence that was never empty. It was full of love. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. Months passed, and the change didn't feel dramatic. It felt steady, ordinary, which somehow made it more meaningful. We slipped into a new rhythm that didn't try to rewrite the past, only soften it. She sent me photos of her garden, just the tomatoes at first, then the flowers. Once, a picture of a burned pie with a message, still edible. I smiled longer than I expected. When work overwhelmed me, I caught myself wanting to call her before I even realized it. Not to fix anything, just to hear her breathe on the other end of the line. Sometimes we didn't talk much. She'd fold laundry. I'd pace my living room. The silence no longer felt like a gap. It felt shared. On her birthday, I visited without telling her ahead of time. She opened the door and froze, like she needed a second to be sure I was real. The hug we shared then wasn't careful. It wasn't restrained. It was clumsy and full and a little late, but it was ours. That night, we sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she used to pour my coffee, just below the rim. I asked her if she ever wished she'd been different with me. She thought for a long time. "I wish I'd trusted that you could carry my feelings too," she said. I didn't know children could. I told her I wished I'd asked more questions instead of making assumptions. We sat with that truth between us. No need to smooth it over. Before I left, she pressed one last envelope into my hand. It was new, dated that morning. "You don't have to read it now," she said. "Or ever." I read it in the car, parked down the street. In the letter, she wrote that loving me had been the clearest thing in her life, even when everything else felt uncertain. That she was proud of the woman I'd become, not despite her quiet, but alongside it. She said she was still learning how to be open, and she hoped I'd be patient with her while she tried. I cried then, not the sharp kind, the kind that feels like release. Driving home, I thought about how many stories we tell ourselves as children just to make sense of the world. How we carry them into adulthood without checking if they're still true. I had lived inside one version of my mother for most of my life. It took time and distance and a box of letters to finally see the whole of her. Now, when I think of her, I don't think of silence. I think of intention, of hands that kept working even when they were tired, of love that didn't demand recognition. I still read the letters sometimes, not because I need proof anymore, but because they remind me to listen differently, to the people I love, to the spaces between words. Some truths arrive late, but when they do, they stay. And this one changed the way I love forever. Years later, when people ask me what changed between my mother and me, I struggle to answer simply. There was no single conversation that fixed everything. No apology speech.
No dramatic moment.
It was more like learning a new language slowly, one phrase at a time. When she got sick one winter, nothing serious but enough to scare me, I flew in without hesitation. I stayed on her couch, made soup that tasted wrong, listened to her complain about daytime television. One night, I woke up to find her sitting at the table, writing. Old habit. I didn't interrupt. I just watched, realizing how much of her life had been shaped by writing feelings she didn't know how to say aloud. Before I left, she handed me that page. It wasn't a letter, just a few lines. She wrote that she was proud of herself for learning to reach instead of retreat, that she was proud of me for staying. At the airport, she hugged me longer than usual. I'm still not great with words, she said quietly. I know, I told her. I hear you anyway. On the plane, surrounded by strangers, I thought about how close we had come to missing each other emotionally, even while sharing years under the same roof. How easily love can be misread when it's expressed differently than we expect. I promised myself then that I would ask more questions, that I would be braver with my feelings, that I wouldn't assume silence meant absence again. Now, when I look back at my childhood, the memories feel altered, not erased. The quiet house, the careful movements, the steady presence I once resented. I see them clearly now, layered with understanding instead of disappointment. My mother still doesn't say, "I love you," often, but she shows it in ways I recognize. In checking my tires before I drive. In sending me home with leftovers. In standing a little closer than she used to. And I've learned something about myself, too. About how easily we inherit the emotional habits of the people who raise us. How restraint can feel like safety. How openness takes practice. The letters sit in a wooden box by my bed now. Not hidden. Not sacred. Just part of my life. A reminder that love isn't always loud, and warmth isn't always obvious. Some mothers teach their children how to speak. Mine taught me how to listen. And that lesson, learned late but deeply, changed the way I understand love, family, and the quiet sacrifices we so often overlook. I started sharing pieces of her story with my friends, carefully, like handling fragile glass. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't exaggerate. I just told them how I had misunderstood her, how I had mistaken carefulness for coldness. Most nodded politely, but a few leaned in, and their eyes softened. They recognized themselves or their own parents in my words. It made me realize how often we measure love by the wrong standards. Outward displays, loud words, constant reassurance. We forget that sometimes love is a quiet rhythm, steady and invisible, guiding us without fanfare. Months later, during a holiday, I watched my mother from the kitchen doorway. She was chopping vegetables, humming softly to herself. Unaware, I was watching. I felt an odd mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. That child who once felt unseen would never exist again, but that child had grown into someone who could finally see. Truly see. I picked up a letter I had started writing to her a week ago. I had stopped midway, unsure if the words mattered. Now they did. I wrote about seeing her, really seeing her, about understanding the choices she made and the courage it took to love quietly, about being grateful for the patience she had with both of us, herself and me. The day I gave her the letter, she smiled softly, eyes glistening but restrained. "You always write so carefully," she said. I laughed, and we both knew it wasn't about writing. It was about finally feeling understood. Later, when I walked out of her house, I noticed how the light fell across the porch. How ordinary it looked. But I felt differently. I carried her patience with me now. Her quiet courage. Her love that never asked for proof. For the first time, I didn't feel a hole where I had once imagined coldness. I felt warmth, steady and real. I realized that learning to listen had transformed more than my view of her. It had transformed me. The letters, the memories, the quiet moments, they weren't just proof of her love. They were proof of what it means to truly understand someone. And in that understanding, I found a peace I had never known as a child. Sometimes, silence says more than words. Sometimes, the most powerful love is the kind that waits patiently for someone to finally notice. Over the next few years, I kept visiting her regularly, not out of obligation, but out of connection. We developed a rhythm neither of us had expected. Mornings with coffee, afternoons with quiet chores, evenings where neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. Sometimes we simply sat together, reading, listening to the house creak, feeling the slow passage of time. I noticed little things I hadn't before, the way she always straightened the corner of the tablecloth, the faint scent of her lavender lotion, the way her eyes softened when she glanced at an old photograph. These small details, once invisible to me, became threads that wove our relationship into something new, something stronger. When my own life became chaotic, she became a quiet anchor. She didn't lecture or judge. She offered a steady presence, a reminder that love wasn't about dramatic gestures, but about consistency, about being there when it mattered. I began to carry that same steadiness into my own relationships, learning the art of subtle care. One evening, after dinner, we sat on her porch watching the sun dip below the trees. I handed her another letter, this one I had written after a rough week at work. She read it slowly, folding it carefully afterward, her fingers lingering on the paper. She looked up at me, her eyes calm and knowing. "I think I understand you better than I ever could before," she said softly. I smiled, realizing that understanding worked both ways. Her life, her sacrifices, her careful, patient love, they had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to see. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool evening breeze touch my face. I thought about all the moments I had misread, all the years of silent assumptions, and I felt a deep gratitude, not just for the letters, not just for her love, but for the patience it took to finally learn how to listen. For the first time, I felt that the distance that had once existed between us had dissolved, not with words, but with understanding and with the quiet acknowledgement that love is often hidden in the spaces between. A few years later, I found myself back at her kitchen table for another quiet morning visit. The sunlight fell across the counter, highlighting the tiny cracks in the wood, marks from decades of use. I realized she had lived her life in those small spaces, tending to ordinary things, yet shaping extraordinary love through them. I sat with my coffee, watching her move through the kitchen with her familiar, careful rhythm, and for the first time, I truly appreciated the weight of a life lived quietly, fully, and intentionally. We talked about trivial things that day: a neighbor's new dog, a recipe I had botched, a movie she hadn't seen. But in those small exchanges, I felt an intimacy I hadn't known existed in my youth. The child who once ached for her mother's attention had grown into a woman who could see the depth in quiet gestures, in pauses, in unspoken concern. The silence that once felt like rejection now felt like a shared heartbeat, steady and reassuring. Later, as I packed to leave, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a simple note: "I hope you always hear the love I carry, even when I don't say it." I held it to my chest, feeling the layers of years, misunderstandings, patience, and devotion. I realized that our relationship was never about dramatic displays or loud affirmations. It was about the consistent, patient presence, about the invisible ways love builds bridges over time. Driving home, I reflected on everything I had learned: patience, observation, humility, and the importance of listening with more than just my ears. The letters, her gestures, the quiet mornings, and even my own past resentment, they had all taught me the same lesson: love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And when we finally understand it, that understanding reshapes us entirely. Years later, when I had my own small apartment and my life was busy with work and friends, I found myself rereading the letters again. Each one carried a weight I hadn't fully understood before. The words weren't just about her. They were about patience, resilience, and the way love can be woven into daily life without fanfare. I realized that every time I doubted her, every time I felt unseen, I had been reading the story incorrectly. Love had been there all along, in every stitch of her careful life. I kept some of the letters on my desk, where I could see them as reminders. Sometimes I read one aloud when I felt overwhelmed. Her voice, captured in ink, became a quiet companion during late nights, teaching me how to notice, to value, to appreciate. I understood that relationships, like letters, often need time before they're fully understood. Patience isn't just for children. It's for anyone learning to hear what's unspoken. One evening, I called her just to say nothing important. She laughed softly on the other end, a sound I had once longed for as a child. We spoke for hours about small things, stories from the past, observations about our daily lives. And in that conversation, I recognized the gift of time, not just the years that had passed, but the moments we now shared consciously, intentionally. The quiet distance that had defined our relationship for so long no longer existed. We had learned to meet in the space between words, in the pauses, in the letters, in the subtle ways love speaks. I realized then that life had given me a rare and invaluable lesson. Understanding takes time, love often hides, and patience can transform what once seemed empty into something deeply full. From that day on, I made it a point to see the love around me in its many quiet forms. And whenever I felt frustrated or impatient with someone I loved, I reminded myself, sometimes the strongest love is the one that waits for understanding, and the most profound connection is found in noticing what's there, not what's missing. On my mother's 70th birthday, I flew back home. The house smelled faintly of baked bread and old books, comforting and familiar. I watched her move around the kitchen with that careful rhythm I had finally come to cherish.
We didn't rush. We didn't overplan.
We just existed together, letting the quiet intimacy of decades fill the spaces between us. I noticed her hands again, slightly wrinkled, still precise, still capable of small miracles. She chopped vegetables for the dinner we would share, humming softly. I realized that I had spent so many years longing for loud declarations of love, when the most enduring expressions had been right in front of me all along. I had finally learned to see them. That evening, we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. She handed me another envelope, her hands slightly trembling. "Just a note," she said. I opened it to find a single sentence. "I hope you never forget that I love you in every quiet way I know." I held her hand, the same hand that had held pens, dishes, and 1,000 small sacrifices. Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't try to hide them. She squeezed my hand just once, firmly, intentionally. No words were necessary. In that moment, I understood fully what patience, care, and quiet devotion really meant. The years of misunderstanding and silent resentment fell away, leaving only gratitude. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, quietly, until the moment you are ready to recognize it. And when you do, it changes everything. Subscribe for more amazing stories.